What we found through Mr. Mueller's report was alarming. The president failed every criterion for rational and reality-based decision-making capacity. My name is Dr. Bandy Lee. I'm a forensic psychiatrist at Yale School of Medicine. A forensic psychiatrist does evaluations for the courts and testifies before legal or governmental bodies. My views are my own, although I do represent the World Mental Health Coalition as its president. My colleagues and I assessed Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report from a mental health perspective. What we found through Mr. Mueller's report was alarming. The president failed every criterion for rational and reality-based decision-making capacity. Our assessment is definitive. Our recommendations were, first and foremost, to remove Mr. Trump from access to nuclear weapons and war-making powers. We could offer many more, but given the urgency, we decided to focus on the two most important. The instability and impulsivity that led us to the brink of war with Iran should illustrate the importance of mental capacity in a president. His actions are exactly what we would predict from an individual who lacks mental capacity. Much of this may have been preventable if we had regular fitness for duty tests for presidents and vice presidents before they even take office. All military personnel who handle nuclear weapons must pass rigorous psychological testing before they assume their duties and must renew it every year. Yet the person who commands nuclear weapons does not. What we performed was a mental capacity evaluation. It tests function, not diagnosis, and in this case, the ability of someone to make sound decisions free of impulsivity, recklessness, paranoia, and false beliefs. To demonstrate mental capacity, one has to be able to take in information and advice, to appreciate and make flexible use of that information, to consider consequences based on rational, reality-based, and reliable thinking without undue interference from impulsivity, conspiracy theories, emotional needs, or fluctuating inconsistency, and to refrain from behavior that places oneself or others in danger. Mr. Trump showed enough evidence to both allies and opponents, as well as in his incitement to violence in public, that he did not possess these abilities. Our work is not about Mr. Trump, who may not be a danger as a private citizen, but about protecting society against the powers of the presidency in a person who has not demonstrated the ability to handle them. As the evidence was overwhelming, and since outside perspectives are more important in a functional exam than a personal interview, we did not feel we needed one. The wealth and quality of the report's content made this possible. In fact, we had more and better data under sworn testimony than we have ever had in our usual practice. Still, we wished to offer the president the opportunity to present for an exam if he believed himself fit, and we asked him to give us an answer within 3 weeks. While his staff let us know that our request was received, there has been no response about a personal exam. Hence, we proceeded with our conclusion and recommendations. A capacity evaluation is different from a diagnostic exam for the purposes of treating a patient. A diagnosis has nothing to do with a person's ability to function in a job. Many individuals with diagnoses of mental illness get the help they need and function perfectly well at work. We are also not interested in a diagnosis because the president is not our patient. Our primary responsibility is to protect public health and safety, as our professional ethics require. Capacity evaluations are usually performed for employers, not patients, and the employers in the case of a president are the people. Our findings also certify the observations of our public service book. The dangerous case of Donald Trump, 37 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess the president. We predicted 2 years ago that Mr. Trump would grow worse under the pressures and the powers of the presidency. Having a president who lacks capacity is like having a captain who is asleep at the wheel. Only worse, since many people will not recognize that he is asleep.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Donald Trump, confronted with America's worst public health crisis in generations, has declared himself a wartime president and has done what past commanders have done when a war goes badly: declare victory and go home. But the war isn't over. Outside New York, the pandemic is still growing, and the latest death toll estimates have more than doubled from what Trump predicted just a few weeks ago. Trump has decided that for the profits of gangster capitalism, the corporate overlords, the ruling business elites, and the CEOs that flank him and that he represents, the economic life of the country must open up, even though he knows and has said some will have to die. Hopefully, that won't be the case, he declared. But as he added, it could very well be the case. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, echoing Trump's words, said that the country needs to reason and reopen, despite dire projections that thousands may die daily and that more than 100,000 may die in total. Christie cavalierly added, "The message is that the American people have gone through significant death before." He pointed to the First and Second World Wars as examples of how we've gone through it and we've survived it. We sacrifice those lives. Huge numbers of people are being asked and effectively forced to sacrifice their lives under the guise of patriotism and love for the economy. They're going to die unnecessarily, as is the case with wars generally. The major question always becomes, who will be the foot soldiers and casualties of this structural violence? The increased rates of death and disability they suffer are from the constraints that society places on them, that keeps them from meeting their basic needs and achieving the quality of life that would otherwise be possible. Their excessive deaths and suffering are entirely avoidable. Our guest today on the Radical Imagination literally wrote the textbook on the subject. Dr. Bandy Lee is a forensic psychiatrist and an internationally recognized expert on violence at Yale School of Medicine. She's the editor of the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 37 Psychiatrists and Mental Health Experts Assess a President, and her textbook, Violence, An Interdisciplinary Approach to the Causes, Consequences, and Cures, is considered the most comprehensive textbook on violence to date. So, Bandy, thank you again once more for being with us on the Radical Imagination to discuss this incredibly profound, important issue. And thank you again so very much for being here. And our audience is overwhelmingly responded to your other visits, and so we're glad you're here again once more.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Yes, and so Bandy, this issue of structural violence, your dedication of your book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, was to your mother and grandfather, who are physicians, as obviously you are. And in that dedication, it says they practice their medicine, their craft, with social responsibility as well. And that is seems so important to your own work. And so let our audience know how you began you certainly haven't followed a traditional path, right, in psychiatry here. Although you certainly have also kept to some of the traditional roles as well, and you're a therapist and so on. But tell us how you got involved with the sort of research and activism that can give us an understanding of what structural violence is and what we're facing today. It's so profoundly relevant.
Mhm. Yes, in fact, what we are seeing today is very much related to the structural violence that I have been writing about and teaching about for almost 20 years now. I became interested in the study of violence because of my upbringing in the
Mm.
violent,
Mm.
in those days, a very violent city of New York.
Yeah, come on, you were in a tough area in the Bronx, right? And
That's
you held
right.
your own. You look very, you're you're a karate expert, right? Or
Yes,
oh,
I
come
am
on, I don't want to give away all your
as
secrets.
well. And I,
No, no mess
I
with
was
you, right?
engaged in fist fights since I was little, and
Yeah.
uh, but there was a time in New York when violence was very widespread, and that's the way I knew the world to be, and was very disturbed by it. When I was a teenager, there were memorials of children my age who have died of violence every other block, and so it gave me the impetus and the desire to understand why violence occurs and how we can prevent it. I was somewhat privileged in that I had professors as parents, and my father was working at the New York Botanical Garden. That's why we were in the Bronx.
Mm.
But uh, but that was my surrounding. I went to schools where there were bullet holes in the windows and there were gangs recruiting out front. And so my interest among my family of doctors was always in psychiatry, and I was made fun of for that. My uncles would say, well, internists know a lot, but can't do very much. Surgeons can do a lot, but they don't know very much. But a psychiatrist does not know very much and can't
Doesn't
do
do,
very much either. Um,
but you went into the field anyway, so
but yes, I believed in the field. In fact,
you
I was
did.
curious about the mind, and I wished to, and I always felt that suffering of the mind was the greatest kind of suffering that one could have, to the point where one would not even mind suffering of the body. And so I felt that that was the greatest help that one could offer another human being. And I am very thankful um, and glad that I decided to pursue the field that I wished to. But there were many hurdles along the way. First, I was told that violence is not an area that psychiatrists study or even get involved in because we treat people who get better, and those who are violent were considered um, pretty much too far gone or to
Really.
be dealt with through the criminal justice system or through security and not through healing. Now, this was 25 years ago, 30 years ago, and a lot has changed. And I was a part of all that revolution where instead of seeing violence as a purely criminal justice and security issue, to apply public health approaches, including the research and study that goes into it, and the public health methods of treating it as a health problem has vastly improved our ability to prevent violence. And in fact, we can see the results all around the world. There was a study that was done from 2000, a measurement that was done from 2004 through 2014. I'm sorry, 2002 to 2014, after the World Health Organization issued its World Report on Violence and Health, providing recommendations of laws, law enforcement programs, community development programs that could be implemented worldwide, and they would see a decrease in especially homicides, but violence in general. And that is exactly what they saw. In 133 countries, there was a vast decrease in violence. There were only a handful of countries in Middle America, in Latin America, that did not see a decrease, but decreases were seen worldwide in the countries that implemented these recommendations. And so we now know that violence is predictable and preventable, and we can study the risk factors and do something about it. Now, the surprise for me was the discovery that violence is actually a societal disorder.
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
I initially thought that I would be dealing with violent individuals and the violence of um, patients, if you will. But what became clear was that individuals, first of all exist in an ecology. And so it's not possible to separate individuals entirely. And there are a lot of conditions we can prevent. Violence is one of them, one of those that we can prevent tremendously, and have a great effect if we approached it from a societal perspective. And we can see that in our own society, because the vast levels of violence that I was growing up with are almost all gone now in the United States. What individual violence correlates best with are social factors, not individual characteristics. And of course, there are certain populations and certain individuals who become vulnerable, and they embody that societal disorder, if you will. But it is a societal problem. And that also highlights the fact that mental illness is not the cause of dangerousness. In fact, there's hardly any increased violence in those who are mentally ill. But even in those who have mental illness, those who are mentally ill are about as likely to be dangerous as the general population. But even if they are severely ill, the factors that make them violent are not the mental illness, but social characteristics such as exposure to substances, or their socioeconomic status, or other things.
Or violent subcultures that they may.
Exactly.
So you do see, or have seen, right, individuals on a one-to-one basis in your therapeutic work. You dealt with violent individuals, correct?
Yes.
And you've tried to work with them and help them obviously become less violent, and among other things in your work. But you're also saying that we need to understand this phenomenon, this behavior, as part of a larger context. So that's why we call it structural. So you get into my area here a little bit. So the structures of society, the cultures, the institutions are all important in understanding the overall framework. And you've come up with this incredible textbook. And I've got, the list of the chapters here are amazing. You talk about the biology of violence, the psychology of violence, the symbolism of violence, the sociology and anthropology of violence, the political science of violence, the economics of violence, and so on, the consequences of violence, the criminal justice approaches. So you have developed a interdisciplinary, comprehensive way of looking at this behavior that is, it's really radically new. And again, certainly only in the last, as you say, 10, 20, 30 years or so have we even begun to think about it in this way.
That's right.
So, yeah. And so the ramifications of this, we often don't think about this structural violence. We just still are thinking about what's wrong with these people. Why are they so violent? Rather than what? The structural forces that have been created. That's why talking about Trump and the various policies that he now is promoting, he and others, which with all probability is going to increase violence.
Exactly.
Exactly. And as you and your colleague James Gilligan has pointed out, I mean, the sociologists have known this for a long while. The best place to learn to become a better criminal or more violent is the prison. So it's the structural context that people are involved in. So this then opens up issues of social involvement or social commitment, as your grandfather and mother would say. And how does that begin to touch on the so-called politics of violence, if you will?
My grandfather actually was an internist, but
Right.
he became a very influential uh, physician during the time when it was shortly after the Civil War in Korea, after the Korean War. So he was treating the destitute and desperate patients of the nation, his nation. And back then, he spent a lot of time talking to his patients, and so had a lot of social influence. In fact, it became such that
as an internist, right? He's
as an internist, it's hard to believe now in our society.
Right. So he
but
started.
Back then,
yeah. Okay.
Back then, as is the case, often the case in third world societies, the president is often corrupt. Politicians cannot be trusted, but doctors and professors can be. And so when you are going for recommendations,
doctors, right? Okay. Yeah.
when you're going for recommendations about the nation, you go to the professors and the doctors, and people came to my grandfather.
Interesting.
So that was my concept of being a doctor growing up, and my mother was always out doing volunteer work and doing services in the immigrant communities in New York City. And so I never pictured myself in a private office exclusively, but I was also surprised when I entered medicine and psychiatry that much of these illnesses can be prevented and are prevented at the social level. Even the most biological mental illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder are more environmental than purely biological. And so the treating, and now we learn more about the social determinants of health. Access to healthcare certainly determines one's level of health for a lifetime. And so we've learned a lot about the ecology of health, and not just thinking of the individual in isolation.
Bandy, if I can, you must have had some pushback in your medical training, perhaps, right, by your professors at that time to what you've just been saying. Weren't they very much rooted in a one-to-one sort of relationship here?
Oh, very much so. I mean,
right.
There weren't concepts of social determinants of health or even applying ecology. There was the George Engel model of biopsychosocial, but that was to try to counteract the biomedical model. And Jim, that's why I went to divinity school in the middle of medical school. As you know, I did a dual degree, and that it was in the middle, partway through medical school, that I decided that wasn't going to be enough, that I needed a divinity degree.
Right. Between which years now you took a break? Between which years?
So I entered medical school in 1990.
Okay.
And was set to graduate in 1994, but Yale Medical School allows 1 year pretty much as an elective. And I used that year to do my divinity degree and spent another half year before I graduated.
Wow. Terrific. So that also, I'm sure, expanded your vision and in your work. Now, this is in the early 90s. Then you begin to work with Jim Gilligan also in the prisons?
Yes, and thank you for mentioning Jim Gilligan because he has been a wonderful mentor and, as you know, just extraordinary to have had exposure to him and to then move on to be his mentee and then a lifelong colleague. And I have to say the textbook that you complimented on is largely attributed and inspired by him. But he taught me a great deal about how to think about violence. He wrote the seminal books of Violence, Reflections on a National Epidemic, and Preventing Violence. And this was even before the World Health Organization issued its World Report on Violence and Health, which
that was in 2014, 15.
That was
right?
2002.
Oh, 2002.
And Jim's books were in 1996 and 1999.
Okay, so just to get the years correct, so you mentioned 2014, 15. The UN also came out with a series.
Let me say that again.
Okay.
The World Health Organization issued its World Report on Violence and Health, a landmark document that brings together all the scholarship on violence and makes it a public health issue that we can study and prevent. That was in 2002. But the remarkable thing is that they took into account a great deal of Jim Gilligan's work from 1996 and 99, when he published Violence, Reflections on a National Epidemic, and Preventing Violence, which are textbooks. I consider them textbooks that I teach with to this day when I hold courses. So he's been a great inspiration in terms of thinking holistically and interdisciplinarily. As you know, he does forensic psychiatry, as I do, which means that we work at the interface of psychiatry and the law. I've been teaching at Yale Law School for 15 years, and we do a lot of work in the criminal justice system. So our work has been interdisciplinary to start, but when you're involved in public health, you also deal with all different fields, including political scientists, economists, sociologists, anthropologists, as well as psychology and biology and so forth, and policy, public health policy. And we work with implementers and practitioners at the same time as doing scholarship, and also international organizations. And so all this interchange has been made possible through the World Health Organization's initiative, first by issuing this landmark report, and then through what they have set up, the Violence Prevention Alliance, of which I've been a member and project group director of, bringing together academic collaborators with implementers and international organizations.
Right.
And government.
Exactly, right. And so as you intertwine your interest and work with the criminal justice system, you know, as I do too, of course, that we're fighting against the long-standing notion that the way to respond to violence, as I think you more or less intimated, is through punishment or to create enough fear to deter. So the idea of rehabilitation or even redeeming somebody's behavior or soul, if you will, is not seen to be part of the agenda. And again, as Jim pointed out too so many times, nobody is beyond redemption. So that's a little touch of the divinity school language there, but it's important to bring that into the discussion. So the criminal justice system itself too is got to break free from some of its rigid background as well. So we're all in this struggle here to create a transformative world. And
and I think that's exactly right. Just as you're doing a radical imagination series, we need a radical transformation from our pattern of thinking where we're stuck. We're stuck in the paradigm where we had been thinking of uh, the only resort to violence being further violence in the form of prisons, police, and wars and the military, whereas those are exactly the wrong things to be doing. In fact, um, as you mentioned, uh, all that mass incarceration has only increased violence. And it was only after we started to share within society and the unemployment rate went down under Bill Clinton that the interpersonal violence rates plummeted. Uh, and and then when the inequality rates started rising again rapidly, it went into the expression. The expression was in the form of suicides, and so we're seeing the rise of violence once again. And Jim and I have done studies of combining rates of um, rates of homicides with rates of suicides. And when we combine them, we can see a correlation exactly with the rise and fall of inequality, which is a form of structural violence, which you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's what I was going to tie in here. So, with the pandemic, the increased danger and probability, if these policies get through, is to increase inequality. And so we should expect what? More violence, or what form might it take, you think, as people rush to come to go back to work, and perhaps a new surge of the virus will appear.
Yes, that's right. So let me just say a little bit about structural violence. The reason why we call it violence is because not only is it lethal just in the same way as behavioral violence or direct violence is, direct violence meaning suicides, homicides, collective violence, and wars. Um, Structural violence causes more than 10 times the rate of deaths from behavioral violence.
Mm.
So when it's that deadly, it's the most lethal form of violence. We should call it what it is. It's a form of violence. It's not only oppression and injustice, it's all those things too, but
Right.
it is a deadly um, act or decision on the part of society.
Yeah, yeah, you're getting to really the core issues here. So why do we keep doing that as a society, as a culture, as a world, rather than, as Gandhi would put it, right? Violence is or is the poverty is the most extreme form of violence. We know that at some gut level. I mean, most of us, and yet we are constantly perpetuating policies that promote the suffering and inequalities. So, what is it about humankind here? How can we break this cycle?
Yes, I think there's been a lot of denial of science and a lot of rejection of expert knowledge. And part of it is to try to push out the overwhelming information that points to exactly what you said, that inequality, these injustices are extraordinarily deadly. And structural violence is also the greatest cause of behavioral violence. So, if we reduced structural violence, not only will all areas of our lives improve, we would also eliminate a lot of the behavioral violence that we see.
So again, why do we need to maintain and perpetuate scapegoats? What is it about those in power and privilege, that and the desire to shame people, humiliate, and then we have a president that's God, just a pro at that, of course. And
Mhm.
and he reach as he does this, millions of people sort of glean on to what he's saying and identify. So again, we need to talk about fundamental issues of power and privilege, don't we?
That's right. So, what inequality means is that power gets concentrated in a small number of people, and there grows a vast difference between the rich and the poor, the privileged and the disenfranchised. And so, you divide society up by inferiority and superiority. And what happens to the psychology of the members of that kind of a society is that in order to have meaning for the self, which is a significant need, we are symbolic animals, and that is one of the reasons why we perpetrate violence. It is so that we could find meaning when no other avenue is available. We resort to desperate measures. And so when you have a society that is divided into inferiority versus superiority, your goal becomes to try to become one of the few superior members who then can look down on the rest. And so the drive to make oneself superior and to maybe step on some other people along the way becomes much more prominent, and people who allegedly have attained that status become idolized, or they're envied, at least.
Yeah. No, what we're saying, actually, I was thinking as you were talking about that, it's not just under capitalism that this happens, right? It's you were talking about Korea and authoritarian states and so on. It's this desire to what? To feel something positive about one's life, but it ends up at the expense of others, and that's a pretty destructive way of living personally and of creating a society, correct? And
Mhm.
yes. So how do
Yes,
we?
in fact, Jim and I did a study of the United States, as you know, of 110 years of our history, and looking at violent death rates over time. And we pretty much assessed that these violent death rates are a great barometer for the mental health of a society.
Mhm.
Not just individuals, but of society itself. That when society becomes more disordered, it will have greater numbers of violent deaths. And so what we see is that when inequality increases through whatever means, it's capitalism now, but it used to be autocratic societies mainly. We in fact did a study of countries, 68 different countries over 40 years' time, where we studied how countries have evolved from autocracy to democracy, and how their violence rates were starting to decrease. There's usually a spike where societies that are suddenly free after decades, if not centuries, of oppression become behaviorally violent because of all the after effects of the structural violence and state violence. But once that settled down, the greater equality of democratic societies were beginning to decrease levels of behavioral violence. Unfortunately, with the adaptation of democratic governments, countries have also adopted their version of capitalism, or became part of the global economy, which has now escalated inequality in far greater ways than any other force in the past. And to the point where all the gains, I believe last year or the year before, went to the top few percent.
Right.
And So when you have that kind of society where wealth and income is so severely skewed to the top, then you're actually going to see a great deal of increase in behavioral violence. And that is what we have been seeing: greater civil conflict, greater geopolitical instability, and wars. So it was within this ethos that Donald Trump was elected. So it is a reflection on the level of societal health that such an impaired, unhealthy individual would be attractive enough to be elected. But once he was elected, he of course accelerated um, the unhealthy trends in society, including all his policies um, of his tax reform, vastly shifted wealth to the upper echelons. His bailouts, his current bailouts, are enormously skewed toward big corporations in ways that no other developed country is doing. And he pulled out over the last few years so much funding from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, just as he is now of the World Health Organization. These are funds that go to public health and public good. And these are the kinds of things that he is dismantling and withdrawing, to the great detriment of public health.
And so your recent work on the dangerous case of Donald Trump, it's not so much whatever individual pathology or even mental illness he has or doesn't have, it's the dangerousness of it. Is that right?
Yes.
So
His public health, his effects on public health, the dangers he poses to public health and safety. So it was our public health responsibility that called us to putting that book together and interpreting the meaning of his mental impairment, not as a patient, not as an individual that we're actually not even treating, but as a public figure who has great influence on public health.
Going back to your grandfather there, in a sense. So now becomes the connection to social responsibility, the physician having to step out of the laboratory, the office, and enter into the public fray, which you have done, and Jim has done, and so many other courageous mental health officials and workers have. And you've now president of an organization, correct? That has taken stands. And so tell us a little about that.
Yes. The public often thinks of the doctor, or especially the psychiatrist, as sitting in a private office and seeing only patients. But that's actually untrue. The preamble to our medical ethics says in the first paragraph that we have a responsibility to patients as well as society. So responsibility to society is built into our ethics, to all our practice, and especially the more information that comes out, the research that comes out on how preventable so many diseases are. We have more of a responsibility to be involved in public health. And that's actually in all our guidelines and instructions. And so as you know, I've been involved in public health and advising governments, advising state governments on prison reform. So Donald Trump was actually not a very new situation for me. And I did write in the book, lest people think that we're trying to treat a public figure as a patient, that this book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, was not about Donald Trump himself, despite its title. We actually see people like him all the time in society. I've seen, at least, I often say I have seen at least 1,000 individuals with his mental characteristics and his psychological dangerousness. But what's unusual is the fact that he was attractive to enough of the population to gain the presidency. even if not the majority. It was the Electoral College, but he somehow was attractive enough. And why did that happen? It's more a reflection on society and the state of our public mental health. In other words, the mental health of our nation and society. But because he is a pathological figure, he is someone who is unwell, and disease by definition brings damage and death. Healthy choices or healthy ideologies are always life affirming. And so as a physician or as a psychiatrist, we don't get involved in ideologies or personal preferences, because as long as the person is healthy, their choices and decision making will be life affirming, and we leave the rest to them. Our goal is to allow the individual or society to reach a level of health where it can implement its choices, and it can have freedom of mind enough to be able to distinguish its choices and not be drawn in by pathology. And the problem of mental pathology is that it takes over your mind, and it makes you believe that what you desire, what the illness desires, is your desire. And one of the impressive experiences that every mental health professional has is to, for a patient who is severely ill, it's to force them into treatment. And of course, they
Resist.
fight it, and they object to it, and they tell them what you tell them, to tell you to leave them alone, and that they are certain of what they desire. But doctors, of course, are trained to tell apart what is the disease that's speaking and what is the patient who's speaking. And the most impressive experience we have is to force someone into treatment and have them come back to you and thank you as if you have done them the greatest possible good deed that they have ever experienced. And that comes to illustrating just how oppressive mental disease is.
Yeah.
And now we're in the grips of it as a nation, and it's causing a public health emergency. We have called the president's mental state a public health emergency from the start of his presidency. But now we're seeing it played out in concrete body counts, because the death toll from a deadly pandemic is vastly increased because of his symptoms.
Therapeutic resistance, right? I mean, people who are, okay,
It's part of the symptoms, yes.
Part of the symptoms and resisting. And yet, again, as you pointed out, the relief at finally being brought to a situation where they can get better. So
Yes.
this is an individual who is suffering enormously, who's making the rest of us suffer. And that's,
yes.
And we still have a few minutes left, but I just, as you were talking, Trump is already seems to be trying to influence the DOC and reduce the power of some of the public health officials who have spoken out. Wasn't this also true among public health officials, psychiatrists that spoke out with Hitler, under Hitler?
The problem under Hitler was that many medical experts collaborated and became instruments of the state rather than independent medical professionals who are safeguarding the health of individuals in society. They performed experiments on human beings, and psychiatrists played a role in selecting who would live and who would die. And the rest of professionals were told to remain silent, just as the Goldwater rule of the American Psychiatric Association is under the Trump administration. That is precisely the reason why the World Medical Association instituted the Geneva Declaration in 1948 after the experience of Nazism. It established an updated version of the Hippocratic Oath called the Geneva Declaration. It charges medical professionals with speaking up against injustices and destructive governments. So we actually have a worldwide obligation. All health professionals take this pledge to speak up about the dangers of a destructive government. And yet the American Psychiatric Association, one mental health association among dozens in this country alone, has this informal guideline, it's not even a rule, called the Goldwater Rule, which states that you should, well, it actually has an affirmative obligation that we educate the public for the sake of public health. If we're asked about a public figure, just don't diagnose without a personal examination and without getting consent. Now, under the Trump administration, a couple months into this presidency, the American Psychiatric Association expanded that rule to pretty much suffocate the part about educating the public and expanding the part about not diagnosing to not uttering any statement about a public figure whatsoever.
Right.
So imagine the ramifications of that.
Yep.
And what we are suffering now, that the public is deprived of the expert knowledge that we have attained partly as a responsibility to society in order to offer it to society. And
the duty to warn, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, not just the duty to warn. We have a responsibility to public health. So to support the public's well-being, any good to society would be worth speaking about. Not just warning about danger, although that was our initial standard, the minimal standard that we required ourselves to meet. But imagine this. Tyrannical societies target first the free press and intellectuals, because these are what empower facts and rigorous knowledge that allow people to evaluate evidence, are what people need to be free and self-governing and to fight oppression, as well as not be oppressed in the first place. And so imagine my surprise at being silenced when we were best positioned to identify a tyrant before the whole nation fell under his spell. And we were the first to be silenced.
Well, you're not silenced here. The only thing that is going to silence us is the clock. But this has been unbelievable. This has been so fabulous. Thank you so very much, Bandy. In just the seconds we have, how can people reach out to you, support you? Because it's so important that we all speak out, and we're going to get the word out. We're going to get people to really hear this message. How can they reach you?
Yes, very important. About 6 weeks ago, we issued a prescription for survival. They can find it on our website, but they can just go to prescriptionforsurvival.org, and it will take them directly to the prescription. They can add their name, they can donate. We'd like to advertise this since the media will not air us. So please help us to get the word out, prescriptionforsurvival.org.
Thank you. We're going to get the word out. You're fabulous. Miss you. And thank you so very, very much again for being on the Radical Imagination. Thank you all. And we'll see you next week. And actually, we're going to have Richard Painter on. So another advocate of what you've been talking about next week. Excellent is right. Thank you so much. This is Jim Vrettos again. Thank you, Bandy, so very much for being on. We'll see you all next week on the Radical Imagination. Take care, everybody.